Welcome to Last Week on Earth. I'm your host, Louisa Magnussen. War in Ukraine continues, marked by large-scale Russian missile and drone attacks targeting energy infrastructure across several regions of Ukraine. This is causing widespread power outages as Ukraine extends its deep strike capabilities into Russian territory. Last night, the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, was hit by a drone strike, causing extensive power and water outages, particularly for residents on the left bank of the Dnipro River. Western countries continue to provide military and financial aid to Ukraine, and reports indicate that Russia's economy is now under severe stress. Overall, the strategic situation of this war is reported to remain largely stalemated. This is Last Week on Earth, and now I would like to welcome my guest, journalist Gavin O'Toole, to discuss the Ukrainian war in more detail and give you an overview of the impact of this conflict. Welcome, Gavin. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. How are you?
I'm good, Wizzy. Good morning to you.
Good morning. So to start us off, could you just bring us up to date on developments in the war between Russia and Ukraine? For example, what happened last night?
Okay, well, just looking at last night, this attack follows nightly air raids. Russia is really pounding Ukraine. Last night they fired and sent 450 drones and 30 missiles against Ukraine, as you mentioned in your intro, targeting energy facilities. There were power cuts in large areas of the capital, Kiev, disruption to water supplies. A lot of people were injured. Further south in Zaporizhia, a child was killed. But this has become a bit of a pattern. Maybe we should just look back at how this war has been developing. This is the latest sort of phase in a war that's been going on now for 3 years. So obviously Russia invaded February 2022. It met much stiffer resistance than it had ever expected. And of course, Ukraine has been very successful getting Western weapons. So since February 2022, Russia has gained only about 12% of Ukrainian territory. There's been a lot of back and forth. There's heavy fighting still in the east, the eastern Donbas region, with some sort of incremental Russian advances. Ukraine has very successfully built a kind of wall of defense along the front line, mainly in the east and towards the south. So Russia, of course, is now increasingly relying on air power and in particular drones and long-range missiles. This, in a sense, limits casualties, but it does mean that they can attack targeted facilities, particularly energy. And Ukraine has responded in kind. So there's this kind of pounding going on. There's a lot of suffering, but particularly in Ukraine, civilian suffering, blackouts, of course, and from time to time, people are killed. Despite diplomatic initiatives in Saudi Arabia, the United States, Europe, no peace progress has been achieved to date. So analysts are basically concluding that what we're witnessing and will continue to witness for some time is this slow war of attrition that could actually go on for years. And Russia seems to be very prepared to continue this war of attrition. So in short, a quick settlement is not at the moment a prospect.
That's an interesting take on it, but surely Putin cannot fight forever. I mean, hasn't the war posed difficulties for his political position, not least his reputation amid other world leaders?
In a sense, it has. Certainly in the West, what we might call the West, Europe and the United States. Of course, Trump came into power almost idolizing Putin as a kind of strongman. He favors strongmen. I think he's obviously been given the lie by Putin's behavior ever since then. But you've got to remember that at the same time, Putin has consolidated some of those more fragile diplomatic relationships as a result of the war. And that's particularly with China and North Korea and possibly even Iran, which supplies Russia with drones. So internationally, the picture is unclear. Putin doesn't necessarily enjoy the enmity of the entire international community. And there are a lot of countries in the global south that feel that it was the West that ultimately provoked this war. So Putin's diplomatic position isn't under siege, so to speak. What about domestically? Are there challenges to him domestically? Well, the main challenge right now to Putin, there's no political challenge, put it this way. There's severe repression and control in Russia under Putin. Almost all his prominent critics have been arrested or they've been silenced in some way or they're in exile. And the laws have been tightened to criminalize opposition, criticism of the government, especially anything to do with the Ukraine war. Now, I don't know if you recall the death of Alexei Navalny. He was a leading opposition figure. Since his death in prison, the kind of opposition movement has lost this unifying character. It's fragmented. So there's no discernible political opposition to Putin, and that looks like it's going to continue. And of course, the propaganda machine under Putin is very successful. There is a lot of defiance in Russia. There's quite a lot of unity behind Putin's message. So limited dissent, quite a lot of repression. But where he's fragile is, of course, the economy. And the economy is showing increasing stress behind this facade of wartime resilience. Inflation's high, interest rates are high, capital flight is severe. Thousands of Western sanctions have isolated Russia since 2022, and growth is basically sustained only by what's called a war economy. That's spending on military production.
I'm going to pause you there. So I'm interested to know, with all of that in mind, why hasn't Russia come to the negotiating table? I mean, what does Russia actually want out of this war?
Well, Russia's arguably been very stubborn, and maybe it has good cause to be stubborn, because if it's not being defeated on the battlefield, why should it compromise? Putin's central goal remains unchanged, and that's to prevent Ukraine's integration in the West and to secure ultimately some kind of political subordination to Moscow. So he frames the war as a struggle for Russia's kind of historic sphere of influence. And even recently, he's made that clear. He wants to address, in a summit with China recently, he said he's still calling for some solution that addresses the root causes of the war. And that's code change in Russian diplomatic speak for regime change in Kiev. Russia aims in the short term to consolidate its control over the areas that it already controls from the battlefield. That's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. It's threatening some small-scale expansions into other areas outside that region it controls. And Putin remains undeterred, even though this is actually the second most deadly war in a century in Russian terms. He's driven by ideology, a sense of his own legacy, and a real personal conviction. He believes that Ukraine is Russian. He's never wavered from his view that Ukraine is actually part historically of the Russian nation.
Now,
So obviously,
you mentioned Donald Trump earlier. We discussed his position a little bit. Didn't he promise to end this war before he entered the White House? I mean, why hasn't he? What's blocked Donald Trump from succeeding in ending this conflict?
great question. I mean, we all know Trump promised with great hyperbole to end the war when he was on the campaign trail, to end the war within 24 hours. Of course, that's not happened. Since taking office, he has prioritized some kind of ceasefire diplomacy. He's paused aid for Ukraine, which puts pressure, obviously, on Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president. And he's sort of conducted quite a lot of back-channel talking through intermediaries. At the same time, he's put a lot of pressure on Europe to take the lead in sort of shouldering responsibility for Ukraine. And of course, he's using tariffs to compel negotiations, not just in Europe, but obviously with Russia. But overall, he's sown a widespread sense that he's more favorable to Putin, and that the US is quite keen on pulling away from Europe after many, many decades of being the European security sort of guarantor.
And that how has Western Europe responded to the way the war is unfolding? I mean, there's the so-called pressure campaign on Europe from Russia. Can you talk us through that, please?
Yes, this pressure campaign on Europe. So the EU actually they've given a name to this, they've called it the grey zone campaign. And this is a campaign of airspace violations by Russia, some very sneaky sabotage, which has also happened in this country, cyber attacks, this kind of thing. Russian fighter jets have breached Estonia's airspace, and they've entered the airspace of other Western countries, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Poland, Romania. And this has prompted the EU to sort of talk tough, but is it really? I think the idea here is now Russia knows that Europe is going to be taking the lead on defending and supplying Ukraine with weaponry. It wants to sort of test Europe's defenses, see if it can somehow breach that kind of rhetorical wall that now pits Europe against Russia. Europe's response initially was actually strangely unified, and it has delivered unprecedented support to Ukraine. It's reduced dependence on Russian energy quite successfully, although there are still countries that are using Russian energy, like Hungary, and this has become a real thorn in the side for Brussels. And of course, many European countries have changed the way of their military procurement, the way they want to spend money on defense, particularly Germany. And this is really important. It's been very ambitious, Germany. In March, German lawmakers voted to allow a huge increase in defense and infrastructure spending. And in German terms, this is a seismic change, because Germany's always, since the Second World War, adopted a much more a much less militaristic perspective towards industry.
Yeah, I know why that is.
Of course, and Germany, this was politically very risky for the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and he faced a lot of opposition. What we've got to remember is that in particular, the left in Germany is very unhappy about this shift to rearmament. But what's important is Germany's spending power. As a result of German commitments, it's launched a new 83 billion euro military procurement plan. That's new money to be spent on weapons. And a lot of that will be dedicated to European industry. Other countries are likely to benefit from this, possibly even Britain. And so that kind of puts Europe in the front line of being the main military supplier. And it's very significant that since June this year, European Union has surpassed the United States in terms of military aid. And that's a significant shift.
That's interesting.
So the US is pulling back. Europe is kind of filling the gap, but not to the extent that the US was.
What effect is that going to have on, for example, Britain's relationship with America and Donald Trump? Is that going to have an impact?
Okay, Britain wants to be part of this European procurement bonanza. And Brussels, in principle, has said, yes, you can partake in this. In the spending of new money, we will throw some contracts at you. But as with everything else, it's a transactional arrangement, and Britain, believe it or not, will have to pay for access to those contracts.
Is that
so
because
you pay...
of Brexit? Would that not have been the case had we remained in the EU?
Absolutely. At the same time, however, Britain, France, and Germany have forged a very successful kind of security understanding about the defense of Europe going forward. And so Britain is very much in the lead of the European security infrastructure. And this is why Starmer is pressing it, because obviously he has committed not to reversing Brexit, but to improving relations with the EU. Security is one area where Britain very definitely can improve relations with the European Union. And in American terms, that's fine. If you recall, America was never particularly happy about Brexit. They saw it as a domestic issue, but they also saw it as Britain shooting itself in the foot. So this would be one way, in a sense, for Britain to bridge the relationship between the United States and Europe, kind of as it's traditionally done, through security.
How should we assess the role of Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy in this story so far? Where is he?
Yeah, obviously, this man has become an international celebrity. His sort of wartime leadership has embodied, in a very Churchillian way, resilience and global communication skills. And he has united Europe and galvanized Western support. The problem is, these things never last, do they? Once hailed as a heroic unifier, he now governs a very weary nation, which is facing economic stagnation and war fatigue. And his administration is facing political strains and accusations of corruption. And if you talk to any Ukrainian you may encounter here in Britain, they will often refer to corruption. Corruption is considered to be a big problem in Ukraine, particularly with all that Western money flowing into the weapons industry. And there have been investigations into procurement abuses, which have dented Zelensky's sort of image as this wartime reformer. So public morale is arguably eroding. He's also centralized power, as he's had to, which early in the war was very necessary, but this has drawn criticism from the opposition, the political opposition, who accuse him of delaying elections. Elections have basically been kicked down the road while the war is being prosecuted. And limited sort of counteroffensive gains against Russia has also strained his relationship with the military. So he's in a very difficult position. He's got to kind of balance unity with the frustrations of leadership. And that's not easy, particularly military leadership. And he's coming under intense pressure within Ukraine to negotiate a solution. They are getting kind of fed up with the war.
Has any progress been made towards reaching a ceasefire, leading eventually to peace talks on that note?
So repeated Western efforts have failed to secure a durable ceasefire. And this is largely because of Moscow's intransigence and its continuing ambition to achieve goals that it says address the root causes of the problem. But also battlefield realities have kind of blocked progress. When a country's gaining ground in the battlefield, it has no incentive to talk, as I said earlier. Now, Trump is the kind of wild card. Since he became president for the second time, he has made ending the war in Ukraine a bit of a priority in a very kind of flaky sense. And he's threatened tariffs on Russia if Moscow refuses a ceasefire. He's held a high profile summit with Putin in Alaska and lots of subsequent meetings with Zelenskyy and European leaders. But this hasn't really produced an agreement, obviously. He's floated ideas of US security guarantees for Ukraine, but he wants something in return. He signed a kind of mineral concord with Ukraine to get back rare earths from Ukraine to try and sort of claw back some of the money he thinks the US has thrown at Ukraine. And Russia insists on talks only on its own terms. And it was notable yesterday that one of the Russian foreign ministers was saying that the whole prospect of talks now seems to be out of the window for the time being, at least. So Ukraine really is also being stubborn. It demands restoration of its original recognized borders and Western guarantees, both things that seem unlikely, if not impossible. But the point is, where does public opinion on both sides of the conflict lie? And in both Russia and Ukraine, public opinion favors negotiations. They want, in particular, Putin and Zelenskyy to sit down. So far, that hasn't happened. About 62% of Russians and 74% of Ukrainians support peace talks.
Given the history of this war so far, everything we've discussed, where do we stand now? What are the possible scenarios for the conflict going forward? What is the future of this war?
So where we stand now is a war of attrition, limited gains, no prospect in sight of talks, more suffering. We're entering winter again, more suffering. The winter battlefield largely freezes up, so it's a very difficult time to actually fight a war. There appear to be three main scenarios going forward. First, one with a low probability is that Russia wins a Russian victory if Ukraine's defenses collapse amid sort of declining US support and European divisions. Russia is still throwing everything it's got at this war through its war economy. It devotes a massive 40% of its budget to defense, which is unprecedented.
And this does such an impact on the economy, the Russian economy. Surely they can't continue to do that for years or year in, year out, can they?
No, they can't. I don't think they can without the growth of public opposition. What we've witnessed as a result of Ukraine attacks in recent months have been queues at petrol stations, very long queues, because Ukraine has been sort of marginally successful in denting Russia's kind of oil infrastructure, and it will continue along that. That seems at the moment to be Ukraine's best effort at defense. But no, Russia cannot continue indefinitely. It will have to choose either to win or to talk eventually, which brings us to the most likely scenario, the second scenario, and that's of a kind of grinding stalemate in which Russia consolidates its gains, maintains limited offensives from time to time, drone warfare, as we've seen, and Ukraine endures a kind of chronic insecurity for the near term while trying to chip away at Russia's oil sector. This seems likely, to be honest, over the next 12 months. But the West is getting tired. Western military spending won't come into effect effectively for another sort of 6 months to a year. So basically, we're in a situation where nothing's going to happen, more of the same. A third scenario, a final scenario that's moderately possible, is that there will be a ceasefire. And that's particularly the case if Russian economic pressures grow, or if Ukraine becomes much more successful with its long-range missile strikes. And this is where a particular development in recent weeks comes to the fore. So there is a lot of chatter now that the US will supply Ukraine with these Tomahawk cruise missiles. And these are kind of potential game changers. They have a very long range, and they would allow, if Ukraine gets them, Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory at oil facilities, but also to strike at Moscow.
How likely is it that they will get these?
Trump is nervous, and he said he wants to know how Ukraine will use these. He won't give them directly to Ukraine. That would be a kind of red line. What he would do is he would give them to NATO allies in Europe. It's a subterfuge, who would then donate them to Ukraine.
Right.
So Trump could always turn around and say, well, I didn't actually supply Ukraine.
It wasn't me.
It wasn't me. But the point is, quite sensibly, which is unusual for Trump, he wants to know how they're nervous. Britain did the same. With long-range missiles. It wants to know how they're going to use them. And of course, Ukraine can make as many commitments as it like, but ultimately, in the heat of battle, it may choose to use them in a way that breaches some kind of verbal agreement with the United States. And that could be not. Moscow is nervous about Tomahawks. They've started saying, well, look, they've hinted that they could attack bases that these are supplied to, for example, in Poland. So that third scenario, will Tomahawks change things, bring about a ceasefire? It could do. I mean, we don't know really what Putin's thinking is. But I mean, whatever the weather, wherever we are with all of those scenarios, there's no doubt the war will continue for the time being, certainly into 2026 and maybe even beyond. We're going into a fourth year of the war, possibly even longer. Europe will replace the US. We know that as the principal backer of Ukraine. Is Europe willing to sustain the economic sort of cost? We don't know. That will be a political question, but ultimately comes to the fore during elections. And ultimately, a stable outcome securing Ukraine's sovereignty and integration into Europe would represent a strategic defeat for Russia, which, of course, Russia is very unlikely to concede. So I think really stalemate is the word of the day here.
Yeah, absolutely. Gavin, that's all we've got time for today on Last Week on Earth. Gavin O'Toole, thank you for your time today. We will be back with episode 4 next Friday on your favourite podcast platform. Just search Last Week on Earth. For now, I'm Louisa Magnussen. Thank you for listening. I wish you a good week ahead. Gavin, once again, thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you.